What if every major economic collapse of the last century was not a surprise, not a coincidence, but the result of the same hidden sequence repeating itself across nations that believed they were too powerful to fail? And what if the United States, right now, is already deep inside that sequence, following it step by step, just like the Eurozone, Japan, and Argentina did before reaching the point of no return? This is the unsettling question that sets the stage for understanding a seven-stage collapse pattern that has quietly shaped modern economic history. You may think this pattern applies only to countries that were already struggling, but the truth is far more uncomfortable. Economies do not collapse from a single blow. They unravel slowly, invisibly at first, until the damage becomes impossible to hide. And once the pattern begins, it moves with a cold mathematical consistency that does not care about ideology, politics, or promises. To understand why the United States stands at stage 5, you need to see how this pattern has unfolded elsewhere. In the Eurozone, it began with excessive debt and structural imbalances disguised as growth. In Japan, it started with asset bubbles that seemed harmless until they choked productivity for decades. And in Argentina, it emerged through repeated cycles of currency debasement and institutional decay. Each country believed it could manage the storm. Each one assumed it had more time. Each one thought its internal strength would compensate for deep systemic cracks. But the pattern does not wait for denial to fade. It does not slow down because leaders refuse to see reality. It accelerates exactly when a nation convinces itself that everything is under control. As we step into this narrative, the question becomes unavoidable. Have you ever felt that something is breaking beneath the surface of the global economy, even when headlines insist everything is stable? The sense that the numbers no longer match the lived reality, that institutions no longer function with the same confidence, that promises from leaders sound more like rehearsed speeches than genuine strategy. What you're about to explore is not prophecy, but pattern, a structure built on historical repetition. And once the pieces fall into place, the view of what comes next becomes far clearer than most people want to admit. Before we move into the next stage of this unfolding sequence, let me know in the comments what you think so far, whether you have sensed these shifts yourself and how you interpret the signs around you. Your perspective matters, so share it below. And while you are here, make sure to like this video and check whether you are already subscribed, because understanding this pattern is the first step to seeing the world more clearly as we continue forward. When you begin to trace the trajectory of past economic giants, a striking pattern emerges, one that reveals how nations slip into decline not through sudden shocks, but through a gradual erosion of their foundations. It starts quietly, almost invisibly, with decisions that appear rational in the short term but carry long-lasting consequences. As we follow the momentum built in the previous section, the picture becomes even clearer. Economies that once seemed unstoppable often begin to crack from within as their internal structures weaken, their political narratives distort reality, and their institutions drift away from the discipline that once sustained their rise. The familiar cycle of rising debt, declining productivity, and overconfident leadership forms the backbone of every major collapse. Yet each country believes it is exceptional enough to escape the outcome. This belief in exceptionalism is not just a cultural trait. It becomes embedded in policy, shaping how governments respond to early signs of trouble. In the Eurozone, for instance, leaders insisted that the system was fundamentally stable, even as imbalances deepened between northern creditors and southern debtors. They believed unity alone could hold everything together, ignoring the structural weaknesses spreading beneath the surface. Japan followed a similar path, convinced that its technological leadership and disciplined workforce would compensate for its ballooning asset prices and demographic decline. The confidence was genuine, yet misplaced, because the underlying system was drifting into stagnation, while leaders reassured the public that recovery was always just around the corner. Argentina presents another variation of this recurring cycle. Instead of addressing the roots of its fiscal issues, it turned repeatedly to short-term fixes that masked the deeper fragility of its monetary structure. Each attempt to stabilize the currency created a temporary sense of relief, only to trigger a new wave of volatility when the underlying weaknesses resurfaced. These examples show that collapses rarely emerge from a single destabilizing event. They are the result of years of cumulative choices that narrow a nation's options until the next shock becomes impossible to absorb. As we move deeper into this narrative, the core argument becomes harder to ignore. The forces that lead empires toward decline are not mysterious or unpredictable. They are consistent, documented, and visible long before the crisis becomes undeniable. What changes from country to country is not the pattern itself, but the willingness of leaders and institutions to confront it before the momentum becomes irreversible. And understanding this universal sequence is essential to recognizing why the United States now finds itself following the same trajectory, already positioned within the most dangerous phase of the cycle, with the next stages approaching faster than anyone is prepared to admit. As the deeper layers of this recurring collapse pattern come into focus, a hidden mechanism begins to reveal itself, one that drives nations from early warning signs into the critical threshold that defines Stage 4 and Stage 5. This mechanism is not a single policy nor a single economic shock, but a fusion of structural pressures that accumulate until they reshape the entire system. When countries enter this phase, the narrative they present to the world often remains optimistic, even confident, while behind the scenes, institutions struggle to maintain the illusion of stability. What becomes striking is how predictable this shift is once you understand the forces at work, because the same combination of debt dependency, institutional fatigue, and diminishing productivity appears every time a major economy crosses this line. Debt plays the central role in this transformation. At first, borrowing seems like a logical response to slow growth, political constraints, or external shocks. But as debt grows faster than the real economy, the structure begins to weaken. Servicing the debt becomes a larger share of the budget, leaving fewer resources for investment, innovation, and public services. This imbalance gradually shifts national priorities away from long-term development and toward short-term survival. The public is seldom told how severe this shift is, because acknowledging it would reveal how close the system is to losing its resilience. Instead, leaders insist that expansionary policies are temporary, that stability is near, that the next adjustment will solve what the last one could not. Once this financial pressure hardens, institutions begin to strain. Bureaucracies that once maintained efficiency start to erode under political pressure, internal conflict, and diminishing public trust. Regulatory systems become slower, less capable, or more vulnerable to capture. The economy becomes increasingly dependent on artificial stimuli to maintain the appearance of growth. Productivity falls as structural inefficiencies deepen, and the gap between what the system promises and what it delivers starts to widen. This widening gap is one of the strongest indicators that a nation is crossing into Stage 4, because social expectations begin to fracture at the same time that political narratives grow more desperate and detached from reality. By the time a country reaches Stage 5, the tension between economic fundamentals and public perception becomes impossible to ignore. Social cohesion starts to break as people lose confidence in institutions that no longer function as intended. Even nations with strong historical reputations begin to show signs of internal exhaustion, and once this exhaustion becomes visible, the momentum accelerates. This is the point where leaders no longer control the trajectory. The system itself dictates the pace, driven by mechanisms that have been building for years. And as we continue forward, this understanding becomes essential for recognizing why the United States now stands precisely within this dangerous intersection of structural decay and rising public disillusionment, moving ominously toward the next stages of the pattern. When a nation enters Stage 5 of the collapse pattern, the most revealing signs are not the dramatic headlines or sudden crises, but the quieter shifts happening underneath the surface. These shifts rarely dominate political speeches or financial reports, yet they shape the destiny of a country far more than momentary fluctuations in markets or public sentiment. As we follow the thread left from the previous section, it becomes clear that the United States fits precisely into this phase, where economic strain meets social fragmentation and institutional fatigue. What makes Stage 5 so dangerous is not just the presence of internal decay, but the way it is denied or minimized, even as it becomes woven into the daily experience of millions of people. One of the key markers of this stage is the loss of cohesion inside vital systems that once defined national stability. Public institutions begin to operate with less efficiency, responding slowly to crises that require agility and competence. Policies once seen as temporary begin to feel permanent, revealing how dependency on debt, stimulus, and emergency measures has quietly become the backbone of the economy. At the same time, structural issues that should be addressed directly are deferred, avoided, or masked behind optimistic narratives designed to maintain confidence. This widening gap between official messaging and lived reality fuels a deep sense of uncertainty, especially as families confront rising costs, stagnant wages, and diminishing opportunities. Stage 5 also exposes the social strain created when economic pressure intersects with declining trust. Communities begin to fracture along political, cultural, and economic lines. People sense that the systems they once relied on no longer function with the same reliability, whether it is healthcare, education, infrastructure, or public safety. The resulting tension is subtle but persistent, showing itself in rising anxiety, frustration, and division. These are not isolated reactions. They are symptoms of a broader societal fatigue that emerges when expectations can no longer be sustained by the underlying economic engine. And as these pressures accumulate, the nation enters a phase where even small disruptions can trigger disproportionately large consequences. Another defining characteristic of Stage 5 is the visible erosion of confidence in the nation's long-standing institutions. The trust that once held society together becomes fragile, and debates that were once civil begin to take on a sharper, more confrontational tone. People question whether the systems built over generations are still capable of serving the common good. This shift does not happen overnight, nor does it come from a single event. It grows slowly, shaped by repeated disappointments, repeated contradictions, and repeated signals that something fundamental is weakening at the core. As the narrative widens beyond the United States, a clearer perspective emerges on how different regions, despite their unique histories and political structures, become trapped in the same irreversible cycle. The Eurozone, Japan, and Argentina stand as striking examples of economies caught between structural limitations and the consequences of decisions accumulated over decades. Understanding their paths does not simply illustrate how the collapse pattern unfolds elsewhere. It provides a lens through which the current trajectory of global economic systems becomes far easier to interpret. What ties these nations together is not their culture or geography, but the way their internal pressures interact with the rigid economic frameworks that were once thought to guarantee stability. In the Eurozone, the core issue lies in the tension between a shared currency and divergent national realities. Countries with vastly different productivity levels, fiscal policies, and economics. Cultures were tied together under a monetary system designed for unity but incapable of flexibility. When crises emerged, the rigid structure left weaker economies unable to devalue their currency or adjust independently. Instead, they became dependent on external support, austerity measures, and repeated restructurings that weakened public trust and suppressed growth. The result is a slow-burning stagnation where imbalances deepen over time. The system survives not through resilience, but through continuous intervention. This long-term fragility creates the conditions for the collapse pattern to advance quietly, step by step. Japan's story follows a different path, but leads to a similar outcome. Following its asset bubble burst, the nation entered a prolonged era of economic stagnation, marked by low growth, declining demographics, and repeated attempts to reignite momentum through monetary expansion. While these measures temporarily softened the pressure, they gradually entrenched the economy in a cycle of dependency on stimulus and ultra-low interest rates. Productivity challenges and demographic decline compounded the structural strain, leaving Japan with fewer avenues for recovery. The system remained stable only because instability was postponed, not resolved. And over time, the country slipped deeper into the pattern where the illusion of control masks the slow erosion of foundational strength. Argentina provides the most dramatic illustration of the cycle, with repeated episodes of inflation, currency crises, and institutional collapse. The nation's tendency to rely on short-term financial fixes transformed each crisis into a deeper structural failure. Currency debasement became a recurring tool, weakening trust in institutions and accelerating social fragmentation. Attempts at stabilization never addressed the underlying issues, leading to an almost predictable return to volatility. Here, the collapse pattern is not subtle or silent. It is visible, cyclical, and deeply ingrained in the nation's economic behavior. By observing these different trajectories, a broader truth emerges. Once a system becomes locked into the momentum of the collapse pattern, it begins to move toward the same destination regardless of its starting point. What changes is not the direction, but the speed, shaped by internal pressures and external shocks that push each country further along the sequence. And as we continue to analyze this global landscape, these interconnected examples form the backdrop against which the United States' current position becomes even more revealing. As we move deeper into the underlying structure of this global sequence, the forces driving nations toward collapse become even more visible, revealing a form of economic engineering that is both deliberate and unavoidable once the cycle has begun. What emerges is not an accidental breakdown, but a predictable progression, shaped by decisions that were once seen as temporary measures. Over time, these choices become permanent features, binding the system to a trajectory that accelerates rather than stabilizes. This is where debt expansion, currency dilution, and productivity decline intertwine, creating a feedback loop that is almost impossible to reverse once its momentum sets in. Debt is often the first pillar to shift from solution to structural weakness. Initially, borrowing is treated as a tool to stimulate growth, stabilize markets, or cushion shocks. But as crises become more frequent, borrowing transforms from a strategic measure into the very engine that sustains the economy. Governments, corporations, and households begin to rely on debt not to build the future, but to maintain the present. This shift marks the moment when an economy loses its adaptive capacity. As interest obligations rise, budgets tighten, and investments that once fueled long-term productivity are replaced with measures designed only to delay instability. This erosion is subtle at first, but it compounds until debt becomes a defining feature of the system rather than a temporary response. Alongside this debt reliance, the expansion of the money supply becomes a central tool used to preserve the illusion of stability. Central banks, pressured to maintain confidence, resort to creating liquidity at unprecedented levels. What begins as an emergency action gradually becomes normalized, and entire financial markets adapt around the expectation of continuous support. The unintended consequence is that currency debasement slowly becomes embedded in the structure of the economy. Asset prices rise, but real productivity gains stagnate. Growth becomes increasingly financialized rather than rooted in genuine economic output. This widening disconnect creates vulnerabilities that are not immediately visible, yet they shape the path toward the later stages of the collapse pattern. The third pillar, productivity decline, emerges not from a lack of talent or innovation, but from the misallocation of resources that follows prolonged reliance on debt and monetary expansion. When capital flows toward financial engineering instead of real production, the long-term capacity of the economy begins to shrink. Infrastructure ages, industries lose competitive edge, and the workforce faces stagnating opportunities. This gradual deterioration is rarely acknowledged openly because the metrics used to measure success become distorted by artificial growth. But beneath those numbers, the foundation weakens year after year. Together, these forces create a system where economic resilience fades while structural fragility deepens. Each attempt to stabilize the present pushes the economy further into dependence on the very mechanisms that erode its future. And as this cycle continues, the transition into the next stages of the collapse pattern becomes less of a question of if and more a question of when, setting the stage for the pressures that follow. As the system advances through this engineered cycle, the most decisive changes are often the ones that almost no one notices at first. They unfold quietly, slowly, beneath the surface of financial markets and political debates, shaping the future long before the public realizes what has happened. These invisible consequences form the bridge between Stage 5 and Stage 6, the point where resilience gives way to fragility, and the underlying structure of the economy becomes exposed. What emerges is a nation still functioning on the outside, but internally strained to a degree that makes stability increasingly dependent on illusion rather than strength. This transition does not announce itself with dramatic events. It builds through small distortions that compound until the margin for error disappears. One of the clearest signs of this hidden shift is the growing disconnect between official narratives and everyday reality. Governments continue projecting confidence, emphasizing recovery and highlighting selective indicators that appear strong, while citizens experience rising pressure, shrinking opportunity, and an expanding sense that something fundamental is no longer working as intended. This divergence is not just psychological, it is structural. It signals that the institutions responsible for maintaining coherence can no longer align the internal health of the system with the external image it presents. When these gaps widen, external shocks that once would have been absorbed smoothly begin to trigger cascading effects that reveal how brittle the system has become. Another subtle consequence is the reconfiguration of economic power. As debt rises and monetary expansion accelerates, the balance shifts away from productive sectors and toward financial entities that thrive in volatility. Markets become increasingly sensitive to policy signals rather than genuine economic performance. Investments flow into speculative opportunities instead of long-term development, creating an environment where wealth concentrates in fewer hands while broader economic foundations weaken. This quiet reshaping of incentives drains vitality from the real economy, leaving it less capable of supporting future growth and more vulnerable to abrupt disruption. Social fragmentation also intensifies during this phase, not through dramatic conflict, but through a gradual breakdown in shared expectations. People no longer agree on what economic health looks like, on who holds responsibility for deterioration, or on what solutions are viable. Communities become polarized as narratives diverge, each group interpreting the same events in fundamentally different ways. This erosion of common ground undermines collective resilience, making coordinated responses to crises far more difficult. The nation drifts into a state where multiple realities coexist, and none of them connect fully with the expanding weaknesses inside the system. These invisible pressures accumulate until they reshape how a country absorbs stress. Small disturbances begin to have disproportionate impact. Markets react sharply to minor policy changes. Social tension heightens with each new disruption. And the entire structure becomes vulnerable to shocks that would have been manageable decades earlier. This is the quiet threshold before stage 6, the moment when the system continues forward, not because it is strong, but because no one has yet acknowledged how fragile it has become. As the system approaches the edge of stage 6, the global currency landscape becomes one of the most revealing indicators of what is unfolding beneath the surface. Reserve currencies are not simply financial tools, they are expressions of trust, geopolitical influence, and economic power. When that trust begins to weaken, even subtly, the consequences ripple through every layer of the global economy. The dollar has long occupied a position of unparalleled dominance, shaping trade, investment, and international policy for decades. But as the pressures described earlier accumulate, a quiet shift begins to take shape, one that signals how vulnerable even the most established monetary systems can become when internal weaknesses converge with external recalculations. This shift rarely begins with dramatic announcements. Instead, it emerges through incremental decisions made by nations seeking to reduce exposure to a system they no longer view as stable. Countries start diversifying their reserves, forming bilateral trade agreements in alternative currencies, or increasing their gold holdings as a hedge against long-term volatility. These choices seem small on the surface, but collectively they reflect a growing hesitation to rely exclusively on the dollar. The fragility becomes clearer as global markets start reacting more strongly to monetary signals from the United States, showing that confidence in the dollar is becoming increasingly sensitive to domestic policy decisions that once had minimal global impact. At the same time, geopolitical tensions accelerate this process. Nations with strategic or ideological motivations to escape the dollar's influence begin building parallel systems, experimenting with regional currencies, or embracing digital alternatives that bypass traditional financial channels. The rise of these competing mechanisms does not immediately threaten the dollar's status, but it marks the early stages of a global recalibration. As more countries explore these alternatives, the network effects that have upheld the dollar's dominance slowly weaken. The world begins to transition from a single anchor to a more fragmented monetary landscape. And this fragmentation reduces the stability that the global economy once took for granted. Internally, the United States faces the consequences of its own long-term choices. High debt levels, entrenched dependency on monetary expansion, and declining productivity create conditions where sustaining the dollar's role becomes increasingly challenging. The strength of a reserve currency depends not only on military or political power, but on the resilience of the economy backing it. As structural issues deepen, the perception of U.S. economic reliability begins to shift. Even minor policy adjustments can trigger outsized reactions in global markets, showing how delicate the balance has become. This early phase of dollar disconnection does not unfold through a single decisive moment. It develops slowly, shaped by countless small actions taken by nations, institutions, and markets that sense the changing tide. The process is subtle enough that it rarely dominates public discussion, yet powerful enough to influence the next stage of the collapse pattern. As these quiet shifts accumulate, the monetary foundation that supported decades of global stability begins to loosen, signaling that the system is preparing for a transition far more consequential than most people realize. As the structure of the global system weakens and the early signs of monetary fragmentation take hold, the final accelerators of collapse begin to emerge. These accelerators are not always dramatic or easily identifiable. In fact, they often appear as routine developments overlooked by those who assume institutions will always adapt and recover. Yet, historically, it is precisely these subtle triggers that push nations from late-stage instability into full systemic rupture. What makes this phase so critical is not just the presence of pressure, but the speed with which small shocks can multiply into consequences that are far larger than the initial event. One of the most consistent accelerators is the breakdown of confidence, both domestically and internationally. Confidence is an invisible currency, yet it functions as the backbone of modern economies. When investors, citizens, or foreign governments begin to doubt a nation's ability to manage its obligations, those doubts translate instantly into market volatility, capital flight, and tightening liquidity. The shift can occur quietly at first, with small adjustments in bond markets or subtle reserve reallocations, but it signals a profound change in how the world interprets risk. Once confidence wavers, restoring it becomes exponentially more difficult, especially when structural weaknesses are already exposed. Another key accelerator is the weakening of political cohesion. As economic pressures intensify, political parties, institutions, and social groups become increasingly polarized, unable to agree on credible solutions. The resulting gridlock prevents decisive action at the very moment swift intervention is most needed. This paralysis makes the system highly sensitive to external disruptions. A financial shock, a geopolitical conflict, or even a natural disaster can trigger cascading instability because the political framework is no longer capable of absorbing stress. Historically, nations entering this phase experience sudden shifts in public sentiment, where trust collapses far more rapidly than the institutions themselves. The third major accelerator is the decline in operational resilience across critical sectors. Infrastructure, supply chains, healthcare systems, and essential services begin to exhibit vulnerabilities that were previously hidden. These fractures often reveal themselves through shortages, delays, or failures that seem isolated at first but soon point to deeper systemic fragility. When core systems malfunction, uncertainty spreads quickly, decreasing consumer confidence and amplifying financial stress. The economy becomes increasingly reactive, with minor disruptions triggering exaggerated responses throughout the entire structure. In addition to these internal pressures, external forces play a decisive role in pushing nations toward rupture. Shifts in global trade dynamics, new alliances, sanctions, or financial realignments can intensify the strain on an already fragile system. As global actors reassess their strategic interests, nations trapped in the late stages of the collapse pattern find themselves with fewer options for stabilization. Their vulnerability becomes visible not only to their own citizens, but to the broader international community, which adjusts its behavior accordingly. By the time these accelerators converge, the system enters a phase where shocks no longer dissipate. They compound. The space for corrective action narrows dramatically, and the trajectory towards stage 6 becomes increasingly difficult to avoid. This is the moment when the structure remains standing, but the forces holding it together begin to weaken at a pace that outstrips the ability of leaders to respond, setting the stage for what comes next. As the accelerators intensify and the system reaches the edge of its structural limits, the transition into stage 7 becomes less about prediction and more about recognizing the momentum that has been building for years. Stage 7 is not defined by a single catastrophic event, but by the moment when underlying weaknesses converge into a chain reaction that reshapes the entire economic and social landscape. Every nation that has reached this point has experienced the same fundamental shift, a loss of control over the forces that once responded predictably to policy, stability, and public confidence. What makes this stage so consequential is that it unfolds in layers, revealing vulnerabilities that were previously hidden beneath decades of accumulated complexity. In this phase, small disruptions can trigger cascading effects that spread faster than institutions can contain them. A sudden shift in currency value, a liquidity freeze, or an unexpected geopolitical shock can ignite a sequence of events that exposes how fragile the structure has become. Markets react sharply, systems tighten, and public sentiment begins to move in directions that neither leaders nor institutions can fully anticipate. The familiar tools used to maintain stability, monetary adjustments, emergency measures, political assurances, lose much of their power, not because they are poorly designed, but because the system has drifted too far from its original foundation to absorb new pressure. What emerges is a landscape where reactions become disproportionate, and the feedback loops that once stabilized the economy now amplify volatility. At the societal level, Stage 7 reveals its impact through shifts in behavior rather than declarations. People begin to reassess their expectations, their priorities, and their sense of what is secure. Confidence that once seemed unbreakable becomes conditional. Institutions that once appeared permanent begin to show signs of strain under the weight of demands they were never designed to meet. This psychological realignment spreads quietly but rapidly, shaping the environment in which economic and political decisions are made. The system continues forward, but with a growing sense that its structure has changed in ways that are not fully understood. What makes this moment so defining is not the collapse itself, but the realization that the forces driving it were visible long before the disruption became undeniable. Nations that enter Stage 7 often look back and see that the signals were always present: the rising debt, the fragmented institutions, the erosion of productivity, the quiet loss of global influence, the widening disparity between official narratives and lived reality. And once the pattern fully reveals itself, the trajectory that follows is shaped not by sudden events, but by years of accumulated strain waiting for a point of release. If you stayed with me through this entire journey, leave a comment saying something like, "I'm here until the end," or "This message was for me." It helps me know who is truly absorbing this deeper perspective. And if this content brought clarity or opened your eyes to the forces shaping our world, consider subscribing so you can follow the next chapters of this unfolding story. A simple like also helps this message reach more people who need to understand what is happening around them. And if you're ready to go even further, there's another video here that connects directly with everything we explored. Click it and continue with me while this conversation still echoes in your mind.